Let's be honest, ministry can take a toll. If you're a pastor or ministry leader, you've probably felt the weight of it. The pressure to always be available, the expectation to have all of the answers, the relentless demand to pour into others, even when your own soul feels empty. It's no wonder that so many pastors hit a breaking point. But what if burnout isn't the end of the road? What if it's actually an invitation to something deeper, healthier, and more life-giving than the frantic pace that you've been living? That's what we're talking about today. Bill Simmons, he discovered this. He has spent decades leading both nonprofit and for-profit organizations, including his current role as president and CEO of Hope Rises International. But after years of running at full speed, he hit a wall. And there was a 3-month sabbatical at Christ in the Desert Monastery that changed everything, leading him to rethink what it means to integrate spiritual practices into daily life, especially in leadership. He has a new book coming out. It's called The Way of Interruption, Spiritual Practices for Organizational Life. And in it, he gives us a simple, but it's a radical framework for leaders who feel trapped by the demands of ministry. So today we're going to be talking about learning to pause, pray, and immerse yourself in Scripture, and why it's not just a survival tool, but it's the way back to real life. If you're exhausted and questioning your future in ministry, or you're wondering, how do I reconnect with God in the middle of all the chaos, then this conversation is for you. Hey, Bill Simmons, welcome to the Life After Ministry podcast.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
You are coming out with a book here in a couple of weeks that we'll get to, but you have quite a backstory. You have ministry experience going way back to being a missionary kid. Give us a little bit of that backstory.
Sure. I was born in Tennessee, and when I was 12, my parents became missionaries. But I followed in my dad's footsteps because he was a business guy who was trying to find a place to use his skills in ministry, and ended up becoming a missionary and running the business side of missions, and did that in Democratic Republic of the Congo. It was Zaire when I grew up there and graduated from high school. Came back after that experience of growing up in Africa, which really changes your perspective on life and the world. And God found a way to sort of naturally knit my story into Christian ministry. I began opening boxes in the back room of a Christian bookstore while I was in college, and sort of never left. Ended up at the heyday of Christian music and books, and the stores growing. I ended up becoming the CEO of 2 different Christian retail chains back before Amazon stole most of the book business from the world, and brick and mortar, and did that for almost 20 years. And after 20 years of doing that side of ministry, of putting resources in the hands of people, my wife and I sort of prayed through what's next. If God gives us another 20 years, what would we want to be true of that? And we found our way into this work. So I've been the CEO of American Leprosy Missions, which is going to become Hope Rises International as we rebrand. But I've been here for 14 years, and I tell people all the time, it's my dream job. I just didn't know I was supposed to dream it. So I have really enjoyed the work that we get to do around the world among people who are impacted by severely stigmatizing disease.
So you wrote a book called The Way of Interruption. And really, if we're going to kind of couch this conversation into a broader topic, we're not here to talk about leprosy as much as we want to talk about burnout in our heart and our soul, which is something that we hear about all the time of people who are on the brink of burnout. But your book started out like an action novel with the tap, tap, tap. And there's a powerful story about a child soldier in the Congo. And that moment taught you about control. And I'd like to maybe just kind of enter into that conversation of like, how does that connect to what you're teaching about with spiritual formation? But give us a little bit of the play-by-play of that story.
Sure. Growing up in the Congo is full of all sorts of interesting and bizarre experiences, especially in the 1980s. But I found myself in a situation where a child soldier was locking and loading his AK-47 and asking me to get out of my car. And you don't want any soldier to do that, let alone a child soldier. And you just don't know if they really know how to operate their weapon or not. And so I went through all of the normal consulting advice my parents had always said. You need to try to get them see if you can go to the embassy and all these things that, of course, don't work out in real life. And I was trying to manage the situation in every way I knew how, and you realize very quickly when someone has you at gunpoint that all of your ability to control a situation is out the window. And it doesn't matter how much you've practiced or how much you think you're responsible for what's going on around you. You realize that I am no longer in control of the situation. And so I ended up essentially giving him a year's salary, all the cash that I had, and was able to get away. But that moment, I think it really frames a lot of my own life and maybe the life of a lot of leaders, where we live in some place where we're trying to manage the world around us with the expectation that we're in control. I think that's one reason a lot of people are afraid of flying. You suddenly realize you're not in control, and we have the illusion of control in our own cars, but in an airplane, we lose that. And I think leaders deal with this all the time, and it's a burden, huge burden that we have. And yeah, so I think that one of the underlying issues for leaders on the edge of burnout is the role of having open hands. We talk about this, thousands of sermons have been preached, I'm sure, about unclenched fists and open hands to God, but living that way as a leader is really, really hard. And I think that's one of the things that leads to burnout. Just one quick thing on that to say, I was in a room of about 50 Christian nonprofit CEOs who run all sorts of sizes of ministries, and had them do a survey on a scale of 1 to 10, on where 10 being I'm completely burned out, and 1 I'm happy as a lark. And that room of 50 sat at an 8.5 out of 10. And that means most people in the room were over 8.5 on a 10-point scale. So leaders are facing incredible amounts of pressure and feel like they're on the edge of burnout. And that was certainly true for me.
So you ended up stepping out and you took a sabbatical at Christ in Desert Monastery. What are some of the indicators? And was this like your normal rhythm? Had you done this? Did you have this ritual of Sabbath? But what is it like? How do you know that you need to go? What was the breaking point for you?
Yeah, so. I was actually in a small group at this group called the Accord Network, which is Christian Relief and Development, international Christian Relief and Development organizations, and sort of that high confidentiality model. And 5 leaders, you share an issue and you give counsel and listening. And there was a lady in my group who had done. She worked for a Christian ministry and doing sort of trauma relief for survivors in Kosovo and Eastern Europe. And so she had a lot of experience with trauma and people going through difficult situations. And after I gave my issue to this group, I remember her saying to me, what you're describing sounds like burnout. And I thought, what? Burnout, like that's not a word I would use. Like that's a leader doesn't say, yeah, I feel like I'm burning out. But I really felt like confronted in that moment by this woman just with this wisdom, and I sat in that for a long time. I had an event not long after that where I was in Ghana and I was on my way back, and the most mundane of all things that happened to someone who travels a lot, but my airplane seat was wrong, was messed up, and I spent 2 hours on the phone with the airline, and And I had this sort of out-of-body experience where I'm thinking, am I having a nervous breakdown over an airline seat? Where's all this peace and zen that I'm supposed to have? And so I remember about 6 months after this counsel about maybe this is burnout, I brought something similar to a similar group 6 months later. And I said, I wonder if I need a break. And so all of these folks in the circle said, you should take a sabbatical. And it was that was the tipping point. It was sort of sitting in this and then being confronted with the reality of my own sort of exhaustion, and then having some more wise counsel to consider a sabbatical. Was, I think, a month and a half later, I went to my board and said, I think I need to take a break. And they were all incredibly supportive and gave me that space. So about 6 months later, I took 14 weeks and tried to understand what a Sabbath was. And so, no, it was not my rhythm. It is now my rhythm. And I take a silent retreat every year, even if it's just for 4 days. And we put as a policy in my organization that every staff person, after 6 years, in the 7th year, they get a 3-month sabbatical. So it's not just for the CEO, it's for every single person in our organization. It takes a 3-month fully paid sabbatical because I think I learned that it's a great gift that I didn't appreciate, and I didn't think I had time to appreciate.
Yeah, I think it is the timepiece, right? One of the things you said in the book was, what if instead of pushing through exhaustion, we let God interrupt our work with the rest that he's been offering all along? And you go on to say, pausing is an act of resistance against the illusion of control. The moment we stop, we acknowledge that God is the one in charge, not us. And I think that we have pastors and leaders who are listening right now who feel exhausted, but they can't imagine stepping away. What do you say to them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, let's be honest, it's hard. It is hard to pause. And, and pause, the definition of pause is an interruption, a brief interruption in action. And I think if we don't have the practice of it, it's difficult to imagine an extended sort of a pause or a break. That's why what I really encourage people to do is what we do in our organization is we're constantly pausing. We're constant. That's what I learned from the monks. These monks at Christ in the Desert, 7 times a day, they pause for prayer and reading the Psalms. And then I had to think, wait a minute, they're interrupting their work to pause, or are they interrupting their prayer with work? Which way is it? And I just decided that is a rhythm needed to be part of what we do. I mean, the Psalms encourage us to do this, and everyone sees this word Selah in the Psalms,
right?
And Selah means pause, but we don't. How many times do we read and then pause and just sit in a pause? We don't do a good job of that. Jesus demonstrated it. I don't have to tell pastors this, but over and over again, Jesus, he paused for so many things. He paused, and how do we do that in our lives? Then how do we set our lives up in a way that we are ready to interrupt it? Sometimes we have to be interrupted, and that's what I would say sort of happened to me, both in my life and finding the ability to take the antidote of Sabbath, which is why I love really leaning into the idea of Sabbath. I try not to say rest and Sabbath in the same breath, because I think we've in our culture where we think we can produce things, that we've overemphasized rest as a part of Sabbath, and Shabbat means cease, not rest. And so, what does it mean just to cease? Stop, because we are convinced, I think leaders especially are convinced that, this, it's all up to us. It's, I've got all this weight on my shoulders. Without me, this ministry would fail. This church will not succeed. And it took me ceasing for 3 months for me to really understand that God doesn't need me to run my ministry, to do what he needs to do in the world. He does not need me. And he just wants me sometimes to be a part of what he's doing. And so I really like the idea of ceasing, because it's the same idea as pausing, just stopping where you are and not trying to. I was terrified taking my sabbaticals, terrified of becoming the CEO of the world's greatest sabbatical. I was going to put this credible plan together. It's all going to be planned out
Mm.
every minute. I was going to, and I threw all of that out the window. I had to have no plan, because that's what being a CEO or a leader is about, is having everything planned and figured out and under my control. So to enter a space of 3 months with no idea what God was going to do, that was terrifying.
I remember our staff, our pastoral staff, went on retreat every year, went up to the mountains, got a big cabin, and we brought a facilitator in one time, and was setting us up to go spend a half day with Jesus, and gave us some thoughts, gave us some things to think about. Here's a couple things you could read, and just he finished praying, and just as we were all getting up to go out and spread out across the forest and the river and everything else, he said, "Just a note for you." He said, "You don't have to do this well. Release yourself from that. Like I'm going to do well and succeed and achieve, even in my time spending with Jesus." But
Yeah.
you don't know this about me yet, but my background is that I'm a Messianic Jew, and so Sabbath is part of our ritual. Right? We pause. And our family, we practice Shabbat. And so every Friday night we gather, my wife makes challah, and we remember God's provision of the manna, double manna in the wilderness. And because we want to try to collect everything we can going into those times. But my biggest, having the heritage doesn't help me whatsoever in slowing down. And so I'm constantly reminded that, this is Shabbat. I'm supposed to actually do this. And so thankfully I have a wife that reminds me and invites me to do that. But it is an interruption, right? Because I'm an achiever. I'm a go type A kind of human. And this invitation coming from God is an interruption. And I love the phrase, the way of interruption, the name of your book. It's powerful. But what is it about us that we resist? We resist interruption. And why do we need it more than ever now?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't speak for the we. I'll speak for the I here. You're talking about your retreat and not having to do it well. One of the first things that happened to me when I went to Christ in the Desert was I had all these. I thought, I'm just going to be great, and we have this silent retreat. I'm at a monastery where there's Cistercians, so they have sort of a vow of silence, so to speak, and this will be great. And I'll just sit out here and read in the middle of the desert. And the first thing I felt incredibly impressed to not do was read. It was just like God was saying, you can read anytime. You don't need more words. Can you just be with me? Can you just be with me? And we talk about communication and communion, and it was communion as a word, as a way of being with God was very foreign to me, and to think that I could understand communion with my wife, for example, where I could just sit with her and I don't have to speak or do anything. I know I can just be with her. But trying to be that way with God was a foreign concept. I need to be reading, studying, doing something to sit in those spaces and be with Him and listen, be attentive. That was really, really hard. But that's because for me, giving up control meant even that. Once again, releasing that I had an agenda. I could somehow solve the unsolvable equation of God by reading another book, some new insight. All of that in my journey of sabbatical was a constant reminder over and over again that God's not a formula, and that I can find this interruption and discover something very unexpected. And I had a spiritual director, and he pointed out to me somewhere along this journey that that for someone who was giving up control, what was happening to me spiritually was that I was moving more and more into more practice and liturgy, which is control in some ways, right? Is giving up the fact that I was going to design my own spirituality and life and end up leaning into things that are very practiced and formed, and that's actually, I have found more liberty in more traditional liturgy than I ever had when I had the freedom of doing it all on my own, releasing myself of that pressure
Mm.
to recreate and reinvent and just do what the church has been doing for 2,000 years. It has been incredibly freeing for me in my own life.
So you introduce in the book the practice of pause, psalm, and prayer as this daily rhythm, and I like that it alliterates because that means it's from God. But these practices, these practices have really changed you personally. What has that done in your life?
Yeah, so the well, I've mentioned some of that change, but maybe for people who are on the edge of burnout, I think for parachurch ministry leaders, and I say that term very specifically because I feel like sometimes a lot of Christian organizations are out over their skis and forget that we exist to support the church in her work around the world, and so parachurch ministry leaders, I think, have an implicit expectation that is not very often talked about, and that is they're hired to come in and run an organization to do a ministry well, to support the church. But there's an expectation somehow that we're also supposed to be pastors and ministers and have this spiritual vision and care for the spiritual formation of our staff.
Mm.
And I actually think that's the job of the church and people's local churches, is to share together in spiritual formation, which is why pastors face this inverted pressure to be leaders who run organizations that operate like businesses, and they have this silent pressure to do that. And so the practices emerged because I honestly was completely exhausted of trying to invent something new, some new spiritual practice in the organization, inspire with some new message or theme. It was exhausting. If I had to keep doing that, it took all of the life out of what I love doing, which is running an organization well that's helping the church around the world. And so these practices are how we start every single meeting. And meetings are, of course, 90% on Zoom anymore. But
Mm.
we take 30 seconds to 3 minutes and pause and try to recollect ourselves and show up to the other person that's bearing the image of God in the meeting that we're in. And we read a psalm out loud morning and afternoon, and then we just say a brief prayer. And I expect absolutely nothing from that. I expect like this is going to make our organization better. It's going to make us more productive. We just pause and read to remind ourselves that God deserves it. And we're just going to reorient ourselves to Him every meeting. So sometimes I get to read the Psalm 7, 8, 9 times a day as we start a meeting. And it is an honor to get to just read the Psalms out loud and know that this Greek word theonoustos in Timothy, that the words they're breathed out again. And I don't have we don't have a metric that we're tracking, a KPI inside our organization that's
Mm.
has our employee retention gone up because we're doing this practice. I have no idea. I just know the church has been doing this for 2,000 years, and there's monks out in the desert and in monasteries all over the world who are still doing it, and they're not doing it because it's aimed at them. And so that I think that's the thing about control, maybe at a meta level, is
Mm.
reminding ourselves it's not about us, and just orienting our lives in sort of the internal bowing of our hearts to God and expecting nothing in return, because He'll always give us what we need. But we're not trying to wring some product out of this practice, and so it's a rhythm. So every staff person in our organization, when they start a meeting all around the world, they have this practice as well, and I don't have to come up with a new topic for next month. I don't have to read some new book and horror of all horrors, be the CEO that has every staff member read a book they don't want to read. We don't do that. We don't do that anymore. God has, I can say, He has definitely set me free from that burden.
Amen to that. I heard, I read about a graphic arts organization somewhere in Europe. It was a firm, and it was very unique. They were very successful, but the owner of this graphic artist firm did something that aligned biblically. And he said, we're going to work really hard for 6 years. And on the 7th year, we're going to give everybody in the organization, we're going to take a year off. And it's going to be our sabbatical year. And from a business mindset, that's crazy, right? Like nobody, and so what he does is actually will send his graphic artists, they can go anywhere out in the world that they want to find inspiration again. And so they could go to Thailand and sit on a beach. They can, wherever that is. And what he found after doing this for a couple rounds over the years was that he came back and his company blew up even more and got even greater. But that's the temptation for us, is that there's an ROI that's attached. I love that you're talking about, we're divorcing ourselves from the metrics of success, the KPIs, that we're going to have everybody be 1%, closer to Jesus, as if we could actually determine that. And so, one of the things that you said was that leaders don't have to manufacture the spiritual life for their teams. They just need to create space for God to move. And I think that's the pressure is, and I even felt this when I was an executive pastor, was you have people who are working at a church and we're there to do the job of the church. And then we also have staff that are saying, but what about my time with Jesus? And where are you creating that space? And we have to have a program. We have staff chapels and all of that. But they're really, the ROI is that we become closer to Jesus.
Yeah. And that we get to orient our lives that way, which comes with some sort of mystical wonder that it's difficult to put our finger on. And I love what you're talking about with Shabbat and Sabbatical, in Leviticus 25, where it says, let the land lie fallow. And it's a lot of instruction for like what you can do with the land and fruit and what falls on the ground, and for your animals and your servants. There's no direction for the people because there doesn't need to be. Because if a farmer has to let his land lie fallow, what is he going to do? He can't do anything. He can't do anything. And I think that is exactly, I made my best attempt at that. I mean, I really think I'm safe in saying I spent in 3 months less than 5 or 10 minutes thinking about my work. I never once prayed for my organization, for a vision, because I felt like that would be tilling the land. And I just let it lie fallow. And the greatest miracle, and for me, it's the closest I feel like I felt like I experienced something mystical and miraculous, was that in not doing that, 2 days after I came back from my sabbatical, I had a very clear understanding of what God wanted us to do as an organization. We completely we sort of turned the boat back to its founding purpose, which was to proclaim the gospel to people affected by leprosy. I think we had started to drift away from that, and I hadn't seen it. But coming back, it was very clear, and it was just sort of simple and true. But it was nothing. I didn't spend a single moment thinking about, we should reevaluate our programs, double down on our call and ministry and unique place as a parachurch ministry organization. I never had any of those thoughts. And so it was like all that time that the land was lying fallow, God He had planted a seed and He was nurturing it. It was no work of my own. And I say that also sort of cautiously, because I think that you could have a Shabbat and have nothing like that. Like, I think to expect that's what's going to happen is foolishness too. God doesn't, we can't cast. I think Henry Nouwen says, there's we can't cast a spell on God that's going to somehow create a result. And so I just know that's what happened. And I think the more important thing is just can we just cease and we let the land lie fallow? And that is hard for ministry leaders to do. To sit in a space where nothing's expected and nothing's generated. That's really hard.
Would you say that there's a difference between interruption and disruption? And I think where I'm leaning on this is that if you don't allow this holy interruption into your life, that eventually you're going to see these places in your life where there's disruption. And does that kind of have things fall apart?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you're talking about consequence, right? If we fail to interrupt and to have Shabbat in our lives, then what happens? And yeah, again, for the one here, I would say I can't afford any longer to have that be the case, which is why having an annual rhythm, knowing that every seventh year I will still take a sabbatical, but every year at least taking 4 days of silent retreat just to remind myself and to sit in that space again. I think where I continue to struggle is on your Fridays. I still find it difficult to really have the strong practice and rhythm of a full day of ceasing. That is still, that's the practice I'm trying to work and see if God will help me see how that could emerge in my life. So if there's something I still want God to do, is to help me experience that. I love Abraham Heschel's book on the Sabbath, and you really get a picture of what a gift it was that God gave us. When he on the seventh day ceased, and then we made rules around it and tried to figure out how to do it right instead of just ceasing. But I love that idea, and I want it. I long for it in my own life, for more of it. It's the thing that still is difficult. So strangely enough, it's easier for me to think about a longer period because you can put it out there on the calendar and know you're going to do it and sort of get geared up for it. But then to do it every week for a full day, that's hard. I'm sure no one listening has that experience.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of putting rules around it, you think the Christian world has done that? Just look at the Jewish people and
that's right. That's
right.
Right.
It's a little. We have Shabbat elevators, so we don't actually have to do the work of pushing the button, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a crazy piece. I remember Rick Warren. He said, and I've never forgotten this. He said that really our call as ministry leaders is to divert daily, withdraw weekly, and abandon annually.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that those are all invitations that are good for us, for the soul, as we connect with God. I've told couples that I've counseled that if you can actually just break away and have that interruption in your marriage where you're diverting daily just to check in with your spouse, to get on that date night and withdraw weekly and get away once a year, at least, to abandon together. Those are going to be practices that will yield fruit in relationships, that there will be an intimacy as you do that with the Lord. There'll be an intimacy as you do that with your spouse, with your kids, and even with yourself. And the Lord is redeeming and restoring all of those things. With that, I wanted to for the person that's already on the brink and on the edge, it can feel like doing this is another thing to do. How do we avoid that?
Yeah, that's I don't think there's an answer to that riddle. I do think it. Maybe whether it's this or someone else, I think it takes, for especially type A leaders, it takes some confrontation. So I think that whether that paying attention, because we probably have been confronted with it, and paying attention to that confrontation when someone's saying, "Hey, maybe you need to take a break. Are you feeling burned out?" And we're going to deal with shame around that. I mean, I still, to write this down and things and talk about, I was on the edge of burnout. I'm like, is that going to be the headline? People, what does that mean? How weak am I? And so I have to, I'm trying to find a bunch of fig leaves to hide the fact that I was actually dealing with burnout. And I still don't want to say it that way. I want to talk about my sabbatical, how great it was. I don't want to talk about, melting down in an airport and how I think I mentioned in the book, I saw the grotesque side of my leadership exhibited, on people like Logan Roy in Succession. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that I can kind of see that I undermine people and I, disempower people. That is not what I want to do. But sometimes we need to be confronted with the grotesque version of ourselves to really be able to see that. Because I think, there are probably very few people in ministry who don't have a right motivation. I can't imagine that really being the case. And so then how do we get ourselves back to a place where we can interrupt? I think it takes confrontation, listening, and then it takes action. And it's going to you have to put something on the calendar. And the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, which many, if not most churches and our organization are members of, has a new policy that's required for membership, which is for boards to support pastors and leaders spiritually, emotionally, in these sorts of ways. And I think people realize it's really, really important. And I think if you have a board who won't give you a break, you can finish that sentence for yourself. I think it's really important. And I think it's really important that boards, church boards and organization boards support leaders because the data say that most leaders are on the edge of burnout and they need support. So that would be, I guess, the other way is that if leaders can't find space, maybe people who are on boards out there could say, "Hey, we need to talk to our leader and assume that he or she is on the edge of burnout. What can we do to support them?" And I would say a sabbatical is one great way to do that.
Well, one of the things that we work with is boards, elder boards, board of directors, to be able to have them wrestle with and ask 9 essential questions. What are the things? How do we care for those who care for others? And that is the invitation. I love that you leaned in and you wrote. And I have great appreciation for anybody who can sit down and actually get the book done. And your book, The Way of Interruption, is coming out. When? Tell us when it's coming out and where we can get it.
Absolutely. March 18th, it will be available. Barnes & Noble, Amazon, it's Kindle, hardcover, paperback, whatever you want. It's there. And I write about the practices, demonstrate our pattern of Psalms. And then we have a bunch of liturgies and prayers we wrote that leaders and other organizations wrote. Because when I looked out into the bookosphere, I didn't really find liturgies written for the moments of organizational life, from anywhere from hiring a new staff person, someone leaving on maternity leave, to digging a new well in some place around the world, having prayers for these sorts of moments. That's all of that's in the book, and I hope it'll be a resource to people who are in organizations around the world.
Well, Bill Simmons, thanks for joining us on the Life After Ministry podcast. We pray that though we are in the area of walking with leaders and pastors, ministry folks who are in that transition season, our hope is always that we can also encourage organizations to not get to that point where we actually have to talk about life after ministry, but that we can have life in ministry that is healthy and whole and living out the way that God has prescribed for us. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Matt. I appreciate it. It's been great to be here.
All right. Shalom. This is a needed conversation. If you're listening right now and you're feeling the weight of burnout, then I hope today's episode has reminded you of one thing, that you're not alone in this. There is life after ministry, but there should be life in ministry as well. It's not just supposed to be survival. We want to see leaders that are flourishing and thriving. So if you want to dive deeper into what we've talked about today, then I encourage you to grab a copy of Bill's book, The Way of Interruption. It releases next week, depending on when you're listening, March 18th, 2025. And it has a lot of practical rhythms. He actually writes out quite a bit, and it gives you a direction and a framework for actually living this out. And so we want to be people who are letting go of control and stepping into the kind of rest and renewal that God wants to give us. And so, as always, if you're in a place where you're on the brink, if you are burning out, or maybe you have burned out and you're on the other side of that trying to figure out what's next, if you are navigating a transition in ministry and you just need support, then reach out to us at Pastoral Transitions. We're here to walk out those seasons with you. Bill Simmons, thanks for being here. And we pray that you would go out, support the work that he's doing in ministry. Get the book, The Way of Interruption. And until next time, shalom.